Positivism, and what it does is it has a particular view of history that is carried over into the history of religion school, which is kind of a backdrop for these critical views of Isaianic authorship. And so, just to use one example, Auguste Comte, C-O-M-T-E, he produces a work where he argues that the way history progresses is from the most ancient form, which is fetishism, a worship of inanimate objects, trees, rocks, birds, so on and so forth. That eventually progresses into polytheism, where gods are in charge of these things. Eventually, polytheism progresses into monotheism, the belief in one God. And there's another important element there, monolatricism, the worship of one God while you're believing in other gods. And then eventually that progresses. In general, we kind of stop there in our consideration, but the other part that's important is for Comte, that still progresses forward a little bit more from monotheism, religion, to philosophy and its discussion of metaphysics, and eventually to what he sees as the golden age of human reason, which would be his time, which was late 18th, early 19th century, which would be the scientific era, the empirico-scientific era. And the whole point that he wants to do in illustrating this progression is that in his era, he can shrug off the religious, theological, philosophical considerations of the past. And now finally he can engage, humanity can engage any field within a context of their own empirical scientific investigation. And coupled with this is an articulation of human autonomy, where we can do it by our own cognition or our own will without any consideration of the Lord. As well as a belief in the way that humanity works. So if you're reading through things like these treatments of the prophets like Bernard Doom and these other guys, they actually hold to this view of the Old Testament, where the patriarchs, for example, are articulating fetishism. Abraham meets God at the Oaks of Mamre. They would say that is a example of fetishism. And for them, and the importance for Isaiah is that it's not until the 8th century, or really the time of Josiah, that monotheism becomes a thing. So for them, the prophets create monotheism, or do ethical monotheism in these things. So that produces yet another different view of what the prophets are. Right. Because from that view, the prophets become actually one of two very different things. On the one hand, some of these critical scholars would argue that what the prophets are but religious geniuses who create monotheism to advance human culture. And on the other hand, a number of scholars who would have very similar views of the origins of Isaiah would say that the prophets are actually irrational enthusiasts who have these ecstatic mantic utterances. So it's actually quite remarkable to watch some of the way this progression in history works in terms of what the prophets are, what they do, and then how that relates to the origins of the book of Isaiah, because you almost have this rational, irrational dialectic, you could say, in the way that they see the prophets themselves. On the one hand, there are these great religious geniuses who create monotheism, create ethics. And on the other hand, there are these irrational enthusiasts who have psychotic dreams like a chariot throne in Ezekiel 1-3 or things like that.